Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. Hello, everyone. How are you all holding up? I know that for many of us, there is a lot of uncertainty and fear in the air right now. Like, you know it's bad when the government comes out and confirms again that yes, aliens exist. And now they're telling us that they live in our oceans. And we're all just like, cool. Like, I thought I'd be way more excited about this kind of news, but my nervous system is so shot from all the other fuck shit that's happening in the world right now. I'm just like, okay, and? Unless you're taking me to meet them and live in their peaceful, advanced society, I don't have the energy to care. Although I think we can all agree that Giorgio from Ancient Aliens deserves a massive apology right now. And someone get David Duchovny on the phone. Get those two together to make a video that just says, "Told you fuckers." But seriously, if you're anything like me, self-care sometimes slips to the bottom of the list. And that's okay. Life comes at you fast and sometimes it's hard to put yourself first. But right now, make it a priority. I have been, and you need to too. Take a bath, take a nap, drink a beer, spend time with your friends, pet a dog. Do whatever you need to do to get yourself recharged. We all need to be well rested for whatever is going to come because at the end of the day, we will never ever stop fighting, no matter how long it takes. In podcast world, I wanted to say welcome to all the new listeners we've picked up. Greetings, my beautiful fellow nerds, and huge thanks to everyone for spreading the word about the show. It really means the world to me that you take time out of your day to hang out with little old me and my goofiness. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I have the best listeners in the entire world. To keep things going full steam ahead, please make sure to rate and review wherever you're listening. The feedback really helps boost the show, making it more likely that apps will recommend Criminally Nerdy to other true crime enthusiasts like ourselves. This episode is airing on November 25th, which is National Parfait Day and National Blasé Day. So, call into work. Skip the small talk and tell your boss that you're opting out of pretending to enjoy things you don't, like Monday mornings. Instead, you're going to indulge in a parfait, or 3. Don't even give them the chance to guilt trip you. You're too blasé to care about their lecture. Enjoy your parfait and blissful indifference. Today is also my lovely wife's birthday, so happy birthday to the most amazing woman I know. I love you more than you will ever understand, and will forever be thankful that you decided to take a chance on the nerdy weirdo who accidentally proposed to you. I hope you have the most amazing day possible. And yes, you all heard that correctly, I accidentally proposed. It's a very short, long story. Moving on. This case was requested by many, most recently, my dad. I've been putting it off because it's such a big case to cover. I want to do justice by every story I tell, and I won't lie that this one intimidated me a lot. But Dad lit a fire under my ass to get out here and tell it. So thank you, Dad, for helping build the confidence I needed to tackle this one. Today, we are going to be discussing the terror that swept across the city of Santa Cruz in the early 1970s, when women were going missing and body parts were showing up in remote areas, leading investigators to believe that they were dealing with a sophisticated serial killer. This episode will set the stage for what the feeling was in the community based on the information given, while the next two, you heard that correctly, this is a 3-parter, will fill in all of the horrific gaps that were given to the investigators by the killer himself. Details that would be studied for decades to come and help shape the way serial killers are profiled to this day. Please be warned that we will be discussing murder and mutilation. The next 2 episodes will also contain these themes, as well as animal abuse, sexual assault, necrophilia, and cannibalism. While this episode is not going to be getting heavily into those details, discussions will get incredibly graphic in the episodes to follow. I've mentioned before that I don't pre-plan these. I am nowhere near that organized. But today is also the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This day honors the date that the Mirabal sisters were murdered in 1960 for speaking out against the oppressive Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic. 9 out of the 10 victims we will cover over the course of this case are women. Violence against women is an epidemic, but we can all be part of the solution. Speak out, support local organizations, and advocate for change. Every voice and every action counts in the fight to end violence against women. Some of my sources for this case were crimelibrary.org, the New York Post, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, EdmundKemperStories.com, the ID docuseries Mind of a Monster, The Co-Ed Killer, and the podcast Serial Killers. The late 1960s and early 1970s in Santa Cruz, California were a whole vibe. The counterculture movement had swept the nation, and the city was fully embracing it. The combination of music and creative influence with political activism and rebellion created an excitement for change and freedom while still having a sense of peacefulness. The town was a destination for many, either for its coastal beauty, the serene forests, or the educational opportunities, most notably UC Santa Cruz. But this beautiful town would soon earn the moniker of the murder capital of the world because of several killers operating in the area at once, baffling law enforcement and placing the town in a constant state of terror. The victims, their stories, and the details of the horrific crimes committed by one of these killers would forever leave a mark on the world. On May 7, 1972, 2 young women, Marianne Pesch and Anita Luchessa, both 18-year-old students at Fresno State, went missing. The roommates had been visiting with friends and were last seen hitchhiking at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Ashby Avenue in Berkeley, looking for a ride home. This was at a time and in an area where hitchhiking was a pretty common way of getting around. Public transportation was limited, and there weren't options at your fingertips like Uber. Most people saw it as an easy, inexpensive way to get around. The women were reported missing immediately, with newspapers alerting the community to be on the lookout for them with the information given by those who last saw them. Both women stood at 5'1", holla at my short queens. Marianne had short brown hair and was wearing a maroon sweater, faded blue jeans, and hiking boots. Anita had long brown hair and gold-rimmed glasses. She was last seen wearing a red shirt and white overalls. Hopes were high that with the descriptions and the widespread coverage of their disappearance, tips would come in. But unfortunately, leads were few and far between. It was as if the 2 women vanished into thin air. That is, until August 15th. Hikers in the remote area of the Santa Cruz Mountains called Loma Prieta came across a severely decomposed skull. Due to the elements and time, the skull was so deteriorated that investigators couldn't even say if it belonged to a man or a woman. All they were able to determine from their initial examination was that the skull had been intentionally severed. An exhaustive search went underway looking for the rest of the remains, but none were found. The Santa Cruz Police Department had never experienced anything like this, and they were on high alert because they knew the killer who had done this was still out there and that they were extremely dangerous. DNA testing wasn't around at this time, but through dental records, they were able to determine that the skull belonged to missing person Marianne Pesch. No other remains were found, but seeing as how she and Anita had disappeared together, they knew it was all but certain that she had met a similar fate. 1 month later, on September 14, 1972, 15-year-old Aiko Koo failed to show up for her Korean dance class. Her friend Hazel, who she had met through dance class, had seen her earlier that day. She was heading to the same class, waiting for the bus, when she saw Aiko from across the street thumbing for a ride. She waved for Aiko to come join her in waiting for the bus, but Aiko didn't see her. When Aiko's mother found out, she immediately reported her daughter's disappearance to the Berkeley Police Department. Since there didn't seem to be any suspicious circumstances around her disappearance, she was labeled as missing and not kidnapped. Her mother was given the excuse that we've heard too many times in these kinds of cases. Well, lots of teenagers go missing, but eventually they turn back up. Aiko's mother was insistent that her daughter would not have just taken off, and that her not showing up to dance class was suspicious. She was a single mother, so she and Aiko were incredibly close. There was no tension at home that would have prompted her to run off. She pressed and pressed, putting up hundreds of flyers. Newspapers aided by reporting her disappearance, asking the community for any leads on the whereabouts of the 5'4", 15-year-old Korean girl with long dark hair. But much like Marianne and Anita, no such leads surfaced. Things weren't exactly quiet in Santa Cruz outside of these three young women. The town was still recovering from the devastating news that John Lindley Frazier had massacred 5 people in October of 1970, and were now faced with the shock of women going missing, with the only evidence surfacing being Marianne Pesch's skull. Not to mention that between October of 1972 and February of 1973, 13 bodies of men and women ranging from ages 4 to 72 would be found beaten, stabbed, or shot. But those 13 are a story for another day. So, to say that law enforcement had their hands full would be an understatement. On January 7, 1973, 18-year-old Cindy Shaw was last seen hitchhiking near the Cabrillo College campus. When not taking classes, she was a live-in babysitter. When the parents of the children she cared for noticed that she hadn't come home or shown up to class, they alerted her mother and she was reported missing. News went out about the 5'4" young woman with long blonde hair, last seen wearing a noticeable blue, green, and yellow coat, blue jeans, and green hiking boots. But unlike the first 3 women, it wouldn't take long for law enforcement to find Cindy. Just 2 days later, on January 9th, a highway patrolman was doing a routine stop when he spotted an arm sticking out of a plastic bag beside the road. Her torso washed up on the beach 2 miles north of the Santa Cruz Pier, and days later, her left hand was found by a surfer. A search went underway, and eventually, all but her right hand and head would be found. The pathologist was tasked with having to basically piece her back together. During the examination, it was determined that she had been dismembered with a power saw, but they could not determine her actual cause of death. The Santa Cruz Police Department didn't put their blinders on for 1 second. They knew that this pattern of young females who were hitchhiking and then disappearing, with 2 found dismembered, meant only one thing. They had a serial killer on their hands. The problem was, they had absolutely no physical evidence or witness statements to work with. Their best guess was, given the way the bodies were found, they might be dealing with either a butcher or someone with a medical background. While theories circulated throughout the community that whoever this killer was had to be an outsider or maybe even a cult, law enforcement didn't agree. The areas where the remains were found were very remote, and this was long before Google Maps, so they believed they were looking for someone local who knew the area well. The killer also seemed to have a basic understanding of jurisdictions. Women were being picked up in one area, killed somewhere unknown to law enforcement in a manner that made identification nearly impossible, and then discarded in a completely different area. This told them that the killer was very intelligent. Additionally, it seemed that this killer was not acting on a whim, but rather in a very calculated manner, and whoever they were getting bolder. Hey horror fans, did you know that you can bring home Smile 2 starring Naomi Scott on digital right now? In this terrifying thriller, an unknown force has latched onto global pop star Sky Riley as reality and her nightmares collide. Buy the film critics are calling the scariest movie of the year by a mile, and get over 40 minutes of bone-chilling extras, including deleted scenes and more. Available at participating retailers, rated R, from Paramount Pictures. For this promotion, the first 5 people to email criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com with the subject line, Smile2, will receive a digital code to download the movie for free. So get all up in that inbox and consider movie night on me. Promotion expires February 19th, 2025. News of Cindy's death spread rapidly, with the media dubbing the monster behind these crimes the co-ed killer. College campuses, law enforcement, and the media urged students not to hitchhike, but many didn't listen. There was already tension between the police and students because of the anti-war protests that had been taking place. While many in the Santa Cruz area were in a state of high alert, others actively protested the request, saying that it was just an attempt to control them by restricting their ability to move around freely. In an effort to combat this, UC Santa Cruz advised those hitchhiking to only take rides in cars with official university parking stickers so that they would at least be in the company of other students, faculty, or staff. Now, I want you to remember that parking sticker. On February 5th, 1973, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Allison Liu were both last seen hitchhiking near the UC Santa Cruz campus. Rosalind shared an apartment with 4 friends. When she didn't return home after her lecture, they immediately reported her disappearance to police. Likewise, Allison's roommate Julie realized that she never returned after her last class, so she was also reported missing. A large-scale grid search went underway that included law enforcement, UC Santa Cruz staff and students, as well as members of the community. On February 13, 1973, their bodies were discovered in Eden Canyon. Both had been decapitated, and one of the women was missing her hands. The women were identified only by the clothing they were last seen wearing as Allison and Rosalind. While fear was spreading, it just so happened that on the same day their bodies were found, police got what they thought was their big break. 72-year-old Fred Perez was working in his garden when he was fatally shot by a man who was seemingly just passing by. The shot was heard by neighbors who were able to get the license plate number of the car the killer was driving as he sped away. They reported it to police, and in no time, they had their suspect in custody. 25-year-old Herbert Mullen. A collective sigh of relief could be felt throughout the community. The police had gotten the bad guy. The nightmare was finally over, right? Well, the answer is yes and no. Herbert Mullen absolutely was an incredibly dangerous man, who after shooting Mr. Perez had brought his victim count to a staggering 13. But like I said earlier, that is a tale for another day. Though he was considered for the co-ed killings, Detective Mickey Alufi, who had been working the cases of the missing hitchhikers, did not believe he was their guy. Herbert killed indiscriminately and had no history of dismembering his victims. This meant that they had not one, but 2 serial killers who had been terrorizing Santa Cruz. While it absolutely was a victory to get this piece of shit off the streets, their work was far from over. Shortly after his arrest, on February 21, 1973, nearly 1,000 students on the UC Santa Cruz campus gathered in silent mourning of Rosalind and Allison at the Quarry Amphitheater. While the students, staff, and community grieved, they had no idea that the man police had in custody was not the one responsible for these horrific deaths, and that sadly, the story wasn't over yet. Investigators got their next lead on March 4, 1973. Near Highway 1 in San Mateo County, a skull and jawbone were found, but they did not belong to the same person. Searching the area further, they found another skull. The 2 skulls belonged to Rosalind and Allison, and they gave police a bit of insight. Though the bullets had been removed, it was clear that both women had been shot in the head with a .44 caliber weapon. Rosalind once, and Allison twice. Working with this information, Detective Alufi went looking into the sales of guns in the area, again having the gut feeling that this person was not an outsider. In April of 1973, the report came back and one name stood out: Ed Kemper. Many officials in the Santa Cruz area were familiar with Ed, or Big Ed as they called him due to his incredible 6-foot 9-inch frame. It was because he would frequent the jury room bar, where the slogan under the sign said, "Come in and give us your verdict." The bar was right across the street from the courthouse and was the place where detectives, patrol officers, and even attorneys would go after work to unwind, discuss their cases, and even their theories about whatever they were investigating at the time. Doing their due diligence, they looked into Ed and discovered that just 5 months prior, on November 29, 1972, his juvenile records had been sealed. While there are limitations when it comes to sealed or expunged records, law enforcement agencies can still access the information contained if it pertains to a current investigation. When they saw that his record was for a double homicide, red flags began to fly. Ed had obtained his firearm legally, hence the record of the sale, because background checks were not required for purchase. However, though his record had been expunged, it was still illegal for him to own a gun. Detective Alufi and his partner went to 25-year-old Ed Kemper's home in Apatos, where he lived with his mother Clarnell, an administrative assistant at UC Santa Cruz, to confiscate the weapon. When they arrived, they explained that he was not allowed to have a firearm in his possession and that they would need to seize it. Detective Alufi recalls that Ed was polite and cooperative. He told the detectives that the weapon was in the trunk of his car and handed it over with zero hesitation. The investigation continued while they were waiting on the analysis of Ed's gun, but as it would turn out, they wouldn't be needing it. In the early morning hours of April 24, 1973, the end of Easter weekend, Officer Jim Connor was working the graveyard shift with another officer, Andy. He heard the phone ring and Andy answered. Over the course of the call, he heard Andy laughingly blow off the caller, saying something to the effect of, "I'm not waking them up, call back in the morning." Kind of strange, but he brushed it off. A few hours later, the phone rang again. Officer Connor heard Andy say this time, "Ed, I told you, I'm not waking up the lieutenant." Officer Connor recognized the name Ed not only as the nice, goofy guy he would drink with at the jury room, but as someone he knew personally. Before becoming a police officer, Jim had worked at a tire shop that delivered tires to nearby businesses. One of those happened to be the gas station where Ed was working. The two struck up a conversation and actually discussed how they both wanted to become police officers. When Jim finally did become an officer, one of the first things he did was drive to the gas station to show Ed his new police car. Oh, boys and their toys. Now curious, Jim asked Andy who he was talking to. Andy told him it was Ed Kemper, the same Ed he was thinking of. Officer Connor told Andy he would talk to him, probably thinking that Ed was just being a nuisance or maybe even was a little drunk. He took the phone and he said, "Hey Ed, this is Connor. What are you doing?" Ed told Connor that he was the one they had been looking for. Officer Connor said he had no idea what Ed was talking about. Finally, Ed dropped the bomb. He said he was calling to confess that he had committed some murders and that he had just killed his mother. He said he wanted to turn himself in. Oh, and BT Dubs, he was calling from Pueblo, Colorado. He told Officer Connor to get a hold of Detective Alufi because he already knew where Ed lived. Officer Connor was beyond baffled, but he decided that they needed to look into this. He kept Ed on the phone while contacting the Pueblo County PD. He also called Detective Alufi out of bed and told him what Ed had said. Detective Alufi didn't take the story lightly, so he jumped out of bed and by 5:20 a.m., he and another officer had arrived at 609 Ord Street. Nothing outside of the home seemed amiss, but no one was answering the door. They went around the back and broke a window to get inside. Once they were in the Kemper residence, they were hit with the unmistakable smell of decomposition. Their search led them to his mother, 52-year-old Clarnell Strandberg's bedroom. They opened her closet and saw that a sheet was covering something. Pulling it back a bit, they could see flesh, hair, and blood. They called for backup and forensics immediately, knowing this was indeed the scene of a homicide. The information was also conveyed back to the Pueblo County PD in Colorado, and an order was given to apprehend. Inside the closet, they found body parts: hands, feet, arms, legs, and her head. His mother's bed was pulled away from the wall, and they found blood covering the wall and floor. They also found a half sheet of paper on the floor amidst the blood with a very concise confession. It read, quote, "Approx. 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of the horrible, quote, monstrous butcher," end quote. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do, with 3 exclamation points. And sadly, that was not all they found. In a hall closet near the front door, they found the body of another woman, who investigators said looked like she had been beaten to death. She was quickly identified as 59-year-old Sally Hallett, Clarnell's best friend and colleague. Investigators also found a bloody bra, young women's clothing, and the IDs and belongings of some of the women who had been reported missing, and some of the women who had been found. They truly were in the home of the co-ed killer. Officer Connor had stayed on the phone with Ed this entire time and heard the sirens in the background when they pulled up to the phone booth on the corner of 21st Street and Norwood Avenue. Ed again fully cooperated when he was told to get down and was arrested without incident. Though it did appear he was prepared for a fight. When they searched the car he had been driving, which turned out to belong to Sally Hallett, they found 3 firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. On the ride to the station, Ed confessed to the murders of his mother and her friend, and also the murders of the 6 other women in Santa Cruz. Investigators were stunned that such a gruesome killer would just turn themselves in willingly and confess so readily. Though he had confessed, he asked to speak about the details of the crimes with Detective Alufi. Alufi again wasted no time. He packed his bags and went to Colorado, where he would inevitably hear the unimaginably horrific details of the co-ed killer's crimes. Meanwhile, the story of authorities catching the serial killer was sweeping the country, and everyone wanted to know, who the hell was Ed Kemper? And that, my friends, is what we will discuss in our next episode, Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, Part 2. That's all I've got for you today, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. If you would like to make a donation to the podcast, there will be a support the show link in the show notes, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/criminallynerdypodcast. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Twitter, X, whatever, at Crime Nerd Pod, or shoot me an email anytime at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, keep it nerdy. Do you have any idea what liver and onions go for on Reticula? I'm not putting that on air. Third kind already. You better run, man. I think the 4th kind is a butt thing. Empathy, Sam! Place ad here. What? Fuck. Kempus? Krampus! You hit 40 and the body just gives right up. Just what? Immediately. Pueblo? Aliens. I could have been at a barbecue. I'm telling you, that cow had my name on it. The car of his trunk.
Nope, nope, nope.
Damn it. I want to believe. But hex your enemies. Smash the patriarchy. That's not how you say that word. It's not that I'm lazy. It's that I just don't care. It's a problem of motivation, Bob.